They left their king to die in the freezing water. A blade in his back, a crown stolen by the wolf he trusted most. No one came for him. She did the northern pack runs on blood oaths and ancient lore. A traitor's poison still burns in his veins. The eastern wolves are circling, and the throne will go to whoever survives the moon ceremony. She is no royal, no warrior, just a healer who refused to let something die. When she finds the scar the blade left, her hands don't shake, howls in the dark. Silver blades, burning passes, a pack at war, an AlphaKing losing control of the one thing he swore he'd protect, her. They all underestimated the woman from the river. I pulled you out once. I won't do it twice. Have you ever made a decision in less than 10 seconds that changed the entire direction of your life? Not the kind you sit with for weeks. Not the kind you write down on paper, draw a line in the middle, put the good things on one side and the bad things on the other and stare at it until the answer shows up. The other kind. The kind where your body moves and your brain is still 3 steps behind saying, wait, hold on, we haven't discussed this yet. And by the time the brain catches up, you're already waist deep in cold water, with your arms around something that weighs more than you do, and the math has stopped mattering. This is a story about that kind of decision. The river Ashvane ran from the northern peaks down through a valley that had no business being as beautiful as it was, considering what the river did to things that fell into it. Cold, fast, gray-green at the surface in a way that looked almost peaceful if you didn't know better. Underneath, a current that had taken horses, taken carts, taken men who thought they were strong enough and proved, in the final way that rivers prove things, that they were not. Everyone who lived along the Ashvane knew this. It was the first thing you learned. Before letters, before your own name, probably. You did not go into the Ashvane on purpose. You did not go in at all after snowmelt, when the water ran highest and coldest and most absolutely indifferent to whatever you thought you were doing. These were facts, not suggestions. The river did not forgive mistakes. It did not care enough about you to forgive you, which was worse. Sarah had grown up with these rules the way you grow up with the shape of your own hands. Familiar, unquestioned, entirely hers. She was 23. Brown hair kept braided because loose hair and herb work did not mix. She had learned that lesson exactly once, involving a candle flame and a poultice that smelled bad enough before adding the scent of singed hair. Hands usually stained green or brown or some combination that made her look like she'd been digging in the earth, which most days she had been. Average height, average build. The kind of face people in the village described as pleasant, which she understood to mean forgettable, which she did not mind because forgettable people heard things that memorable people didn't. She had worked with Marin for 6 years. Marin was the herbalist at the forest's edge, the one with the low stone walls and the roof that leaked in exactly one spot she refused to fix because she said it kept her honest about the weather. Marin had taught her everything worth knowing about plants and wounds, and the people who came in carrying both. How to identify roots by touch in the dark. How to mix a poultice that brought swelling down in hours. How to set a bone while the patient screamed and your hands stayed steady because steady hands were the difference between a bone that healed straight and one that didn't. How to look at a wound and know, before you touched it, whether it was the kind that closed or the kind that just kept opening. Marin had also taught her a philosophy, which was this. You look at what is actually in front of you. You name it accurately. You do not flinch from the name, even when the name is uncomfortable. Especially when the name is uncomfortable, Sarah had found this philosophy useful in herb work. She was about to find it useful in ways she had not anticipated and could not have prepared for. Every morning she walked the same path. Cottage to Marin's. Through the village past the market square, where Haddon sold dried herbs at the second stall from the left and always waved, then down through the riverside trail because it was faster, and because she liked the sound of the water in the early hours when everything else held still. The sound was different then, quieter, almost gentle. Almost like the river was pretending to be something it wasn't, which... Fine, she liked that too. She liked contradictions. She was comfortable with things being 2 things at once. It was a Tuesday in late autumn. The air had that bite to it, the kind where winter wasn't asking permission. The kind that made your lungs ache in a way that felt clean, which was strange to think about something that hurt, but Sarah had never been bothered by strangeness. She came around the bend in the trail where the ridge jutted out over the deepest part of the river, the spot where the current was worst, the spot every child was warned about by name, with hand gestures and serious faces. And she stopped, because there was a wolf on the bank, the largest wolf she had ever seen. In the wild or out of it or in the drawings Maren kept in the old books on the high shelf. Dark grey fur, almost black in the early light. Blood matted along the left flank in dried layers, which meant it had been bleeding for a long time and stopped and started again, which meant the wound was deep enough to reopen with movement. One foreleg bent at an angle that made her stomach drop. The angle that meant broken, not maybe. Broken, it had fallen from the ridge above. She could read that from the trajectory, the scrape marks in the mud where it had landed, the distance from the rock face, the way the body lay. Not curled, not positioned, just dropped. The way things lie when they've stopped being able to choose how they land. And it had been there for hours. The cold had gotten into it in the visible way cold gets into things that are losing their fight. That stillness that isn't rest, it's resignation. The body deciding without quite deciding that the effort of staying warm has become more than it's worth. Sarah stood on the path and her brain did what brains do. It ran through the list. Wild wolves were not her concern. Wild wolves in this part of the realm were rare enough to be remarkable and dangerous enough to be left alone. Everyone agreed on that. Maren had said it directly when Sarah mentioned once, just once, seeing tracks near the eastern tree line. Maren had set down her mortar and looked at Sarah with the expression she used when something was a rule and not a suggestion. You leave them alone and they leave you alone. That is the only arrangement that works for everyone involved. So, a wild wolf, dying, the natural order proceeding as the natural order proceeded. A 23-year-old woman of average build should stand up and continue to work and let it happen, except the wolf exhaled. A long, slow breath that paused at the end in a way that made her chest constrict. She recognized that pause. 6 years beside Maren, watching animals and people arrive at the border between alive and not quite. That pause said, this is close, this is soon, this is almost done. Her brain said no. Her hands were already pulling off her outer coat. She knew it was insane while doing it. The water was cold enough to stop a heart if you went in wrong. The current at this bend could pull you under in seconds. She was not large, not a strong swimmer. The most physically dangerous thing she had ever done was carry heavy baskets up a steep hill, and even that had left her winded and swearing under her breath. And the wolf was enormous. Its head alone was the size of her torso. Its body was, she didn't have a reference. She'd seen wolves before, at distance in the blue-hour light of early evening. They were big. This was something else. A scale that didn't match what she knew, which her brain flagged, and she filed away and did not let stop her, because the wolf breathed out again. That same unfinished breath. And Sarah waded into the ash vein, the cold hit like a fist. An actual physical impact that emptied her lungs so completely she thought for one blank second she was drowning standing up. Water to her thighs in 2 steps. Ice with a current underneath grabbing at her ankles, pulling her sideways. Testing whether she meant it. She meant it. She braced, leaned, got to the wolf. Its fur was coarser than she expected, dense, and her fingers sank through to the body underneath. Warm, meaning alive, meaning she had to move right now. She got her arms under it and pulled 20 minutes. That was how long it took. 20 minutes of dragging and slipping and bracing her feet against invisible rocks, and the current grabbing her, and the wolf's dead weight shifting in her arms, and her muscles screaming things she didn't know muscles could scream. The cold crept through her skin into her bones and started doing things to her coordination that she recognized from Maren's hypothermia lessons and could do absolutely nothing about except move faster. The current took her twice. The first time she went down to one knee in the water and felt the river try to drag her sideways, and something in her, stubbornness more than strength, sheer refusal more than technique, shoved back. The second time the wolf nearly slid toward deeper water, and she made a sound she would never describe to anyone and hauled it back with both arms, and something that felt close to anger directed at the river personally for having the audacity to try to take the thing she had already decided was hers to save. She got it up the bank, onto a flat section above the waterline, laid it on her coat because the ground was cold and wet, and she could replace a coat but probably couldn't replace whatever this was. Strange thought. She was past editing her internal monologue, sat back on her heels in the cold mud, soaked to the waist. Shaking so hard, her teeth clicked together in a rhythm that was almost musical if you had a terrible sense of humor about bodily distress. She looked at what she had done. The wolf breathed. Steadier. The difference between dying and merely injured. She could see the wound on its flank clearly now, and she leaned in, frowning. The wound was wrong. Not wrong the way wounds were wrong. Wrong in a way she recognized from Marin's teaching. Falls tore, falls scraped, falls left jagged edges where body met rock at speedied. This wound was narrow, deep, clean at the entry point. She touched the edge with freezing fingers. Something had made this wound before the fall. Something sharp, deliberate. Something that went in straight and came out clean, a blade wound. And the edges showed a pattern she'd seen only in the old books on Marin's high shelf. Books about wounds that didn't heal right because the instrument carried something in the metal. Marin called them wounds with intent. Sarah filed this. She did not say it out loud. Instinct told her this piece of information didn't belong in the open air yet. She pressed strips torn from her undershirt, cleanest cloth she had, against the bleeding. Pressure first, stop the blood. Everything else second. The lesson didn't stop applying because the patient was a wolf. It did not wake. Its breathing steadied under her hands. She arrived at Marin's cottage an hour late and soaking from the waist down with a story about slipping on the bank path. Not entirely untrue. The part about the wolf was a detail she chose to leave out. Marin was 73. A face that had been beautiful once and was now something better, knowing. Grey hair kept short because vanity wasted time that could go to plants. She looked at Sarah with the expression of a woman who had been alive long enough to recognize a partial truth when it showed up dripping on her doorstep. She said nothing. Handed Sarah dry clothing from the chest by the fire. A cup of something hot that tasted like ginger and something she couldn't identify, spreading warmth through her chest like a slow-lit furnace, then went back to her work. No questions, no comments, nothing, which was somehow worse than questions. Sarah changed, warmed herself, spent the day grinding herbs and preparing tinctures and not thinking about the wolf on the riverbank, which meant she thought about nothing else. The wound, the size of the animal, the way the injury looked deliberate, the way its breathing changed when she'd pulled it clear, from dying to surviving, as if the difference between those two things was a decision and not a fact. She went back at midday, told herself it was professional interest. She replaced the makeshift packing with proper linen from the small kit she'd brought, a kit she had packed that morning before leaving for Marin's, which she was choosing not to examine the implications of. She applied a poultice Marin kept for animal wounds, calendula, comfrey, yarrow, things that stopped bleeding and encouraged new tissue regardless of whether the patient walked on 2 legs or 4. The wolf did not stir. She talked while she worked because silence made her nervous and because she had a habit, long established, of narrating her actions when alone. Marin said it was because Sarah thought better out loud, which was true, and also because she was fundamentally incapable of not having opinions about things, which was equally true. I don't know how you got up on that ridge. She pressed the poultice with both hands. The path is barely a path. More of a suggestion that something could theoretically walk there if it had terrible judgment. Which, you clearly did, obviously. Given where I found you, she secured the bandaging. Looked at the wolf properly for the first time without the panic of the river and the urgency of the wound. You're very large. I want you to know I noticed that. If you wake up and decide to eat me, I will be extremely annoyed given the effort I've gone to here. She stayed until dark. Went home, came back the next morning, and the next. On the 3rd morning, the wolf had moved, several feet closer to the tree line, in the lee of a rock where wind didn't reach. It had been conscious in the night. Mobile, it had assessed its position, relocated to a better one, and had not left. A wolf that could move but chose to stay where she would find it. That struck her. She stood on the path above and thought about it. She rebandaged the wound, and stopped, because the wound was different, not worse, dramatically better. In a way that made her sit back and stare and run through everything she knew about tissue repair. The deep layers were rebuilding from the inside out. Deepest tissue first, middle layers following, surface closing over them last, as if the body understood the correct order and was executing it with a directed purpose that went beyond ordinary biology. 6 years with Marin had shown her enough animal injuries to calibrate expectations precisely. A wound like this on a dog or a horse would take weeks, leave scarring, probably get infected despite the poultice. This was day 3. The wound was halfway closed. She sat with this, let the information settle. Did not name it out loud because naming would change things and she wasn't ready for that change. But she filed it. In the part of her mind where she kept truths that were real and important and not yet ready for daylight. Day 4. The wolf's eyes were open. She stopped on the path, 15 feet of cold autumn air between them. Morning light coming through trees in bars of pale gold. The wolf lay on its side, head lifted, watching deep amber, almost gold, a clarity that felt directed, intentional. The kind of gaze that didn't just look at you but looked at what you were made of. She felt, standing on that path with her kit in hand and morning cold on her face, that she was being evaluated by something with standards she could not entirely grasp, and that the evaluation had not yet concluded. She came down the bank at her usual pace. Slow, deliberate. How are you feeling? Better than 3 days ago, I'd imagine. Though that's a low bar. She changed the bandaging, it watched throughout. She talked because she always talked, and because the silence without talking would have been a loaded silence, an acknowledged silence, and she was not ready for that. You can bite me if you feel the need to. But I'd rather you didn't. When she finished packing her kit, she became aware the wolf had shifted closer. Close enough that warmth from its body reached her through the cold air. She looked at it. It looked at her. Something in those eyes she couldn't name, older than gratitude, closer to recognition. The weight of what she had done and what it meant, and the fact that she had done it without knowing what she was doing it for. You're welcome. She stood, walked up the bank, did not look back, but knew, with certainty she couldn't fully explain, that the gaze followed her until the tree line took her from view. Day 6, gone. She came down the bank in the early grey to find the flat section empty, her spare linen undisturbed. Only the body-shaped impression in mud already filling with last night's rain. She stood there, then picked up the linen, tucked it into her kit, walked on to work. She told herself she was not disappointed. The wolf leaving when it healed, that was the correct outcome. The one she'd been working toward. Maren would say it was the only reasonable response. She was almost entirely not disappointed. The forest was quiet on both sides of the path. The river moved. She walked. She thought about eyes that shaded toward gold and wounds that healed too fast, and a blade mark on a wolf's flank that had no explanation she was willing to say out loud. She thought about these things and could not quite arrive at a conclusion because the conclusion, when she tried to look at it directly, kept sliding sideways. 3 days later she found the deer, coming home from Maren's in late afternoon, light going amber through the trees. There on her doorstep, a deer, freshly killed, centered on the top step with a precision that was anything but accidental, placed, not dropped, laid the way you'd position a gift on a table, deliberate, intentional, careful. She stood on the path and looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at the tree line, nothing visible, nothing moving, but a quality in the stillness that was different from empty stillness, a presence in the absence, the feeling of being watched by something choosing not to be seen. She brought the deer inside. It fed her for a week and a half. She said nothing about it to Maren or anyone else. What would she say? A deer appeared on my doorstep with the precision of a chess move delivered by something I cannot see. She could imagine Maren's expression, not disbelief but patience, the look of someone waiting for Sarah to catch up. She wasn't ready for that look. A week after the deer, the herbs. This gave her more pause. Wild herbs correctly identified, bundled with knowledge of what paired and why. The combination was one Maren used for wound treatment. This wasn't guesswork. This was practiced understanding. She stood on the doorstep holding the bundle and staring at the tree line. Still nothing. Still not nothing. She brought the herbs inside, used them, and she began. Telling herself it wasn't a conscious decision, which was a lie, because she had absolutely made this decision while pretending she hadn't. Leaving things on her doorstep each morning. A piece of bread, a wrapped portion of whatever she'd cooked. She told herself she was feeding a stray. She told herself many things during those 2 weeks. The things she left vanished overnight. Things appeared in return, more herbs, always correct. Once a fish so large she needed both arms to carry it and still bumped it against the doorframe. Once late-season berries from the upper ridges, places she had never been because the climb was beyond her reach. Someone who knew what she worked with, what she needed, what she ate, her schedule, her habits, her routines. Going to considerable effort with considerable knowledge and considerable consistency. For 2 weeks running. Without showing a face, she sat with this the way she sat with all uncomfortable knowledge. directly, with her hands around her morning cup, letting the thing be what it was without trying to bend it into something easier. Then the carving, on the doorstep where food usually appeared. A piece of dark wood worked with a knife. She picked it up and turned it in her hands in the cold air, and something in her chest shifted without her permission. A river, the movement of water caught in still wood. Current suggested in the grain, bank implied by the edge. The whole shape flowing even though it was motionless. Whoever had made this had looked at a river the way she looked at wounds. Seeing the structure underneath the surface, the truth of the thing beneath the appearance, she went inside. Put it on the shelf above the fire where she could see it from every part of the cottage. Sat at the table and named it, because Maren had taught her to name things, and this was the moment where the naming could not wait any longer. The carving required hands, human hands. Hands that could hold a knife and turn wood and understand beauty and want to communicate it. Hands belonging to something that also left deer and herbs and berries. Something that had watched her with gold-touched eyes on a riverbank. Something that healed at a rate that had nothing to do with ordinary biology. Something wounded by a blade, not a fall. What she had pulled from the ash vein had not been only a wolf. She let this be true, let it rearrange the architecture of what she knew. Let it settle. She was practical, always had been. Maren had refined it into something close to philosophy. Look at what's in front of you, name it, don't flinch, fine. Something that could be a wolf was choosing, with clear and sustained deliberateness, to be in a relationship of exchange with her. And it wasn't a wolf, and it knew where she lived, and it slept. She was nearly certain now, behind her in bed on the nights she left the door unlatched. The warmth along her back that had appeared and returned every night since. The impression in the blanket each morning, too large and too warm for anything she could explain away. She had left the door unlatched. She would be honest about that. She told herself it was a statement of availability, not an invitation. There was a difference. She was fairly sure there was a difference, mostly sure. That evening she did not latch the door, went to bed in the dark, lay on her side facing the wall and listened. The fire settled. Wind pressed against the cottage and moved on. Then the door. The careful weight moving through the cottage with a deliberateness she'd learned to recognize. How it navigated between table and wall. How the floorboard near the hearth took the weight differently than it took hers. She lay still. Heart doing something she'd describe, if pressed, as vigorous. Brain doing something she'd describe as profoundly unhelpful. Cycling through observations like the thing is in your house, the thing is in your house, and then underneath that, quieter. The thing has been in your house for a week and a half, and you've been sleeping better than you have in years. So maybe your brain should sit down. The warmth settled along her back, steady, real. She put her hand behind her, found fur, dense, warm. Kept her hand there. Outside the frost deepened. The river moved. The carved piece sat on the shelf above the dying fire, the current caught in the grain of the wood. She slept. In the morning she found something at the threshold she'd missed in the dark. A smear of blood, not old, not dry, maybe a few hours. She crouched and looked at it carefully. This wasn't the wolf's blood. She knew that blood by now, the color and consistency of it from days of wound care, mapped in her mind like one of Maren's herb charts. This was darker, different. She touched it with one finger, looked at the ground around the door, scuff marks in the frozen mud she hadn't noticed before. 2 sets of tracks leading away from the cottage toward the eastern ridge. One large and purposeful, one smaller and no longer holding a straight line. The smaller tracks staggered, dragged, thinned out. Something had been chased from this door into the dark, and whatever chased it had not had difficulty catching it. She stood, looked at the blood, the tracks, the carved river on her shelf visible through the open door, the warmth that had been along her back all night, steady, real, present. While 10 feet away, something had tried to reach her door. She understood. The thing in her bed wasn't only recovering, it was standing guard. Something had come and been met and handled quietly in the dark while she slept. She looked at the tree line. The tree line held its silence. She thought about what Maren would say, name it. So she named it. Something was coming. Something was already here. And she was in it. Had been since she waded into the ash vein and got her arms under something enormous and refused to let go. Whatever came next, the choosing was done. The choosing had been done on the riverbank, in cold water, with muscles screaming and the current pulling and a body in her arms too heavy for her to carry and too alive for her to leave. She cleaned the blood from the threshold, packed her kit, walked to work. The carved river sat on the shelf in the empty cottage. Morning light came through the window and caught the edge of the wood where current met bank, where wild met still. The next morning she walked the path to Marin's in early frost. Trees bare, air sharp. The river arguing with rocks below the trail in its constant way. She stopped halfway, looked at the tree line. The space between the trunks where the shadows gathered in ways that were just shadow and also. She had stopped pretending, not just shadow. She had learned to feel it the way you learn to feel someone's eyes on the back of your neck in a crowded room, a quality of attention, a directed awareness. I know you're not only a wolf, she said it to the trees, conversationally. The way you'd mentioned that it looked like rain. I don't need you to show me. I just want you to know that I know. I'm not frightened. She paused, considered. I'm a little frightened, but not of you. More of the size of what this is. How much room it's going to take up. What I'll have to rearrange to fit it. The trees held still. The frost sat undisturbed. Something in the silence deepened, a quality of listening that had weight and texture. She had not expected a response and did not get one. What she got was the distinct feeling of having been heard by something that was taking the hearing seriously. She continued walking. That evening on her doorstep, a second carving, a wolf sitting upright, head turned slightly, the angle of listening. The posture was not threatening, not defensive, attentive, present. The kind of stillness that meant the opposite of inaction. The head caught at exactly the angle that said, I am paying attention to everything, and I have been paying attention for longer than you know. She held it in the fading light, ran her thumb along the lines of it, put it on the shelf beside the river. She lay in bed that night and looked at the dark ceiling and thought about what she wanted from this, and was honest in the way she was always honest, which meant she stopped telling herself the comfortable version. She was not tending something wounded and exchanging fair goods with a neighbor. She was in something, had been since the river, and the something was in it too. Had been for approximately as long. Neither of them had asked for this. Both of them were choosing it anyway. The choosing was the thing. The next morning on the path she stopped again, spoke to the trees again. Louder this time, clearer. I need to know who you actually are. She went home that afternoon and sat at the table and waited. She was prepared to wait a long time. She waited 10 minutes, then she heard the door, and the sound was wrong. Wrong in a way that made her sit up straight. Not the careful animal weight she had learned to recognize. Heavier in a different way, a different kind of heaviness, the sound of boots on stone. She did not turn immediately. She sat with her hands flat on the table and breathed, then turned. He filled the doorway. That was the first thing, and it was the thing that stayed. He was enormous in a way she had understood from the wolf, but which landed differently when it was shoulders instead of fur, a chest instead of a barrel ribcage. Hands instead of paws, a face hard angles, old lines, a jaw that looked carved from the same stone as the mountain passes visible from her window on clear days. Dark hair with gray at the temples, pushed back from a forehead that carried scars, and eyes that were the amber she knew. The same gaze, the same directness, the same weight behind the looking. He wore borrowed clothes, not his, too short in the leg, too narrow across the shoulders, seams straining against a frame they had never been built to contain. He stood there, and the amber eyes carried something she would need considerable time to process. But she did not have considerable time, because in the next second she heard a different sound. Outside, behind him in the dark yard, and everything accelerated. A whimper, low, animal. The sound of pain from something that was not given to making sounds of pain. Bandage Wren. I have to clear the trail, his voice, low, rough. The texture of something that hadn't been used in this form for weeks. Like a machine starting up after a long shutdown. Every word waited, and he was gone, back into the dark, and she was alone with a bleeding wolf on her kitchen floor. The wolf that had come through the door was smaller than the gray, dark brown, almost red-furred, female, and injured in the way that made training take over before thinking caught up. 3 wounds, shoulder, shallow, painful but manageable, ribs deeper, needed watching, hind leg bleeding in the active, pumping way that meant something close to the femoral line had been nicked. Sarah was on her knees with her kit before she finished processing that a man had just materialized in her doorway and that her first coherent thought had been that borrowed clothes looked terrible on him, which? Not the point. Not even close to the point. She packed the leg wound. Pressure. The femoral wasn't severed. If it had been, this wolf would already be dead. But something adjacent had been cut and the bleeding was significant. She used the good linen, applied the poultice she'd mixed that morning for a villager's burn, repurposed because medicine was medicine and the body did not care about your original plans. The wolf, Wren, whimpered once. Small. From a creature Sarah suspected was not given to small sounds. I know, she kept her hands steady. I know it hurts. Stay with me. Shoulder wound cleaned and packed. Rib wound dressed. Leg wound responding to pressure. After 15 minutes the bleeding slowed from pumping to seeping. She sat back. Her hands shook. They always did. During the work they were stone. After the work they remembered they were human. She allowed it for 30 seconds. Then stopped it because the door was opening again. He came back differently. The urgency gone from his movement. Whatever had been in the tree line was no longer there. She could read the answer in the way he moved, controlled and deliberate, and in the stains on the borrowed shirt that were not his own blood. He looked at Wren on the floor. At the bandaging. At Sarah's hands. She met his eyes across 6 feet of cottage floor. Sit down. I made food. Not what she'd planned to say. She hadn't planned anything. But it was true. She had made stew that morning. It was in the pot by the fire, and she had made too much, which was not, she now understood, an accident. Some part of her had been cooking for two for a week without admitting it. He looked at the pot. Something moved behind his expression, the confusion of encountering behavior he had not accounted for. He had just changed form in her doorway, had told her to bandage a bleeding wolf, had disappeared to deal with something with his hands, and her response was stew. He sat down, she ladled 2 portions, set one in front of him, sat across from him at the table where she had eaten alone for 3 years, and which now felt recontextualized with him in the other chair. Not smaller, different they ate. She did not ask questions yet, not because she lacked them. She was made of questions. But Maren had taught her something about timing that went beyond herbs. You don't harvest before the plant is ready. You don't cut before the wound is clean. You don't ask before the person sitting across from you can answer honestly. And this man was still remembering that he had a mouth for words and hands for utensils and a body that fit into chairs. She could see him adjusting. The micro-negotiations of a form he hadn't worn in weeks. His fingers handling the spoon with a care that was almost funny. Hands that had carved rivers out of wood fumbling slightly with a piece of cutlery, because cutlery required different precision. He finished. Set the spoon down. My name is Aldrich, 3 words. Delivered with the economy of someone relearning how sentences worked, Sarah. I know your name. Of course he did. He'd been sleeping in her cottage for weeks. He probably knew the name of every herb in her kit, and which floorboard creaked and what time she woke up. Which was a thought she would set aside for now, he told her. Sparse sentences, each one complete, undecorated, carrying only what it needed. Alpha of the Northern Pack. 11 years. His second, Fenric, had been building a challenge for the last 2, quietly, recruiting wolves who were unhappy or ambitious or both, waiting for the right moment 6 weeks ago. The ridge above the ash vein. Aldrich had been driveling alone, deliberately. The way an alpha in crisis sometimes needed to move, without the weight of every eye, without calibrating who needed what, without being the answer to every question for a single day. He had walked the ridge because it was high and empty, and the wind up there cleaned things out. Fenric had known the route, had positioned 3 wolves above the narrowest point, 2 from behind, 1 at the edge. The blade came first. Not teeth, a ceremonial blade, the kind used in formal challenge rituals, drawn only in ceremony before the full pack with witnesses. Fenric had drawn it in ambush on a mountain trail, driven it into Aldrich's flank while 2 wolves hit from behind. And a third, a wolf named Corvin, who Aldrich had personally brought into the pack as a yearling, pushed him over the edge. They went back and told the pack their alpha had vanished, walked into the mountains alone and hadn't returned. The story designed to justify what came next, which was Fenric, moving into the leadership space, consolidating. And this was the part that hardened Aldrich's voice, negotiating with the Eastern Pack, trading Northern territory for their support. If Fenric took control, the Northern Pack would cease to be independent. 11 years of what Aldrich had built dismantled in a handshake between a traitor and an opportunist. Wren, the wolf on Sarah's kitchen floor, had found him through old trails that Fenric didn't know about. She'd been followed. 2 of Fenric's trackers picked her up on the eastern ridge. That was what Aldrich had dealt with tonight. Sarah sat across the table and absorbed this. Fire crackling. Ren breathing steadily on the floor. The river outside in the dark. How long do you have? 12 days before the succession protocols require my presence or my absence. Can you shift? Fully? Not yet. The wound, no self-pity in it, just fact. The blade damage, even with accelerated healing, was deep enough that the full sustained shift was beyond him. He could manage bursts. Enough to fight. Not enough to run the distance to the Northern Territory. Not enough to hold the form long enough for a formal challenge. She looked at him. Borrowed clothes that didn't fit. Hands that had carved 2 pieces of wood with skill and patience, and left them on her step like letters, written in a language that didn't use words. Then you stay here until you can. The briefest flicker around his eyes, his version of surprise, which involved very little visible movement and a great deal of internal recalibration. They'll look here, let them look, Sarah. First time he said her name, she felt it land. 2 syllables carrying more than they had any right to. I pulled you out of a river. You left me a deer and herbs and 2 pieces of carved wood and slept in my bed for 3 weeks. Whatever is happening, it is already happening. There is no version of 12 days from now where I pretend it isn't. He was quiet. She could see him working through something. A habitual expectation meeting the reality of her and finding the 2 didn't match. The 12 days began. Sarah went to work each morning at the same time. Same path, same people, same conversations. She maintained the surface of her routine with the precision of someone who understood that any change in pattern was itself a signal, and she was not in the business of signaling to people she didn't trust. Aldrich stayed in the cottage. He healed. Ren healed beside him by the fire, faster than Sarah expected. The same accelerated repair, the same directed purpose in the tissue. By the 3rd day, Ren was mobile enough to station herself in the yard like a sentry with sharp ears and sharper attention. By the 5th, she was moving well. On the 6th, Aldrich told Ren to go, back to the Northern Territory through the old trails, carrying word to the wolves still loyal that their alpha was alive and coming. Sarah bandaged Ren's leg one final time, tightened the wrapping, checked the edges, survived the trip. She said it plainly, to a wolf in her kitchen. The wolf looked at her with brown eyes that held intelligence and something else, acknowledgement maybe, the recognition of a debt. Then Ren was gone, through the back of the yard and into the tree line, moving fast and low and healed enough to make it. Probably. Sarah hoped probably was enough. The cottage with Aldrich in it was different from the cottage with the wolf in it. He was not difficult exactly. He was large, in every sense. The physical size that made the furniture wrong, the chair too small, the table too low, the doorway an obstacle rather than a passage, and a quality of attention that made it impossible to be in the room without being observed. He noticed things. The way she organized her herb jars, by frequency of use, not alphabetically, which Maren would have disapproved of, but which Sarah found more practical. The way she favored her left hand for fine work and her right for strength. The way she hummed without realizing when she was concentrating. He noticed and he did not comment, and the not commenting was its own kind of intimacy. She found she did not mind. On the other evening he sat at the table and carved while she worked on her herb records. The silence between them was comfortable in a way that surprised her. She had expected to feel crowded. She didn't. She felt accompanied. Different thing entirely. She watched him work without making it obvious. His hands moved with economy. The knife finding the grain and following it. No wasted motion. The shape emerging from the wood the way shapes emerged from Maren's work. By removing what wasn't necessary until what remained was true. What is it about rivers? He looked up. You've carved 2 rivers now. He looked at the wood, then at her. My mother used to say the river doesn't fight the shape of the land. It finds the path that's actually there and takes it completely. She said it was a lesson about power, that the strongest things don't push. They find what's real and move through it. Sarah was quiet for a moment. She sounds like Maren, a brief, almost smile. Gone before it fully formed. She was nothing like Maren from what I can imagine, but the philosophy is similar. Records, wood, fire, river outside. She went back to her work. He went back to his, and the silence held them both. Maren knew. Of course she knew. Sarah arrived at the cottage the next morning, and Maren was grinding something that didn't need grinding, the busy work of a woman waiting for a conversation to begin. There are men from the northern passes asking questions in the village. About a wolf, large dark grey. They say it belongs to the northern pack. Maren set down her pestle. They're not asking gently. Sarah kept her hands on the herb bundles. Steady. Professional. What do they want with it? Maren turned and looked at her with an expression Sarah knew well. A conclusion reached, waiting to see if the other person had arrived there too. The northern pack is not an ordinary pack. Everyone along the Ashvane knows this. The alpha hasn't been seen in 6 weeks. Other alphas are circling. If he doesn't return within the month, succession opens, and the men asking questions are not looking for a wolf to bring it home safely. Sarah put down the bundle, kept her face neutral. She had learned neutrality from Maren, who had learned it from necessity. The armor of a woman who knew things she couldn't always afford to show she knew. She went home by the longer route, avoiding the village center. Walking quickly, the cottage was quiet when she arrived. Aldrich not visible. Wren had left 2 days ago. Sarah went inside and stood in the center of the room and looked at the shelf above the fire. 3 carvings now, river, wolf, and a third he had added the day before. A woman standing at a door, looking out. She had recognized the figure immediately and also not at all. The posture was hers, the slight forward lean, the way one hand rested on the doorframe. But the woman in the carving held herself with a certainty that Sarah wasn't sure she possessed. Or maybe hadn't recognized in herself until she saw it reflected in wood. She spoke to the room. I know you can hear me. I think you can always hear me. There are men in the village looking for you. I don't know what I'm protecting or why they're dangerous, or how much of what I've assumed is true. But I know you didn't leave when you could have. I know you came back. I know the things you've left on my step required hands, and I am done pretending I don't know what that means. She picked up the wolf carving. Turned it. I need to know who you actually are. All of it. The parts you've been holding back. She sat. She waited. He came through the door 10 minutes later, boots on stone, borrowed clothes. He sat across from her and told her the rest. Fenric's deal with the Eastern Pack, the territory trades, the wolves within his own pack who had been turned, the scope of what he was walking back into. She listened. Asked 2 questions, both about logistics, both sharper than he expected. She saw the pause before each answer, the pause of a man adjusting his estimates upward. When he finished, she was quiet, processing. Running the information through the part of her mind that Maren had trained, the part that looked at what was actually there and named it. The weakness is the timing. If Fenric moves before you call the challenge, you lose the initiative. You need someone in the village who can tell you when he starts moving. Someone you fully trust. He paused. Long enough. I know people in this village. I've been here my whole life. Fenric's men came to my door and found me very uninteresting. They'll reach the same conclusion next time, Sarah. I'm not offering because I don't understand the risk. I'm offering because I do. She held his gaze. You pulled yourself back from dying on a riverbank. You are not going to walk into your pack alone with half a plan and a gap in it that I can close. He looked at her. For a long time. All right. Good. Tell me who to watch. The 7th day brought them to the door. 3 men, northern clothing, hard-worn faces. Sarah heard the boots on the path before the knock. 3 sets, heavy, the cadence of people who expected doors to open for them. She met them at the door, wearing the expression of a woman whose afternoon had just been mildly inconvenienced. The one in front was tall, lean in the way of something built for distance. He smiled when he saw her. The smile involved his mouth and nothing else. They asked about the wolf. She gave them nothing. Patient, slightly bored tone. Yes, she saw wolves near the river sometimes. No, nothing recently. She was an herbalist's apprentice. Chamomile and comfrey, not wildlife. The tall one looked past her into the cottage. She stood square in the doorway. Then the second one, shorter, thicker hands that had done things she didn't want to catalogue, moved forward, past her, into the cottage without asking. The way you enter a space you believe belongs to you. She did not block him. Blocking would have been suspicious. She stepped aside and let him look. The interior was clean. Aldrich was gone. He'd heard the boots on the path too. Moved with that sense for danger that operated on a frequency beyond her understanding. She was grateful for it without fully comprehending it. The thick man walked through her home, opened the chest by the fire, looked in the pot, ran his hand along the shelf where the 3 carvings sat. He picked up the wolf, turned it over, set it back down. Then he looked at the floor near the hearth, at a spot she had scrubbed that morning, where Wren had lain bleeding 6 nights ago. She had cleaned it thoroughly. She understood that blood told stories. She had missed a spot, one dark smear against the stone, half hidden by the hearthstone's edge. His eyes found it, her heart slammed. Her face did not move. "I butchered a rabbit last night," she said it without inflection, without the micro-hesitation that would flag a lie. 6 years of maintaining steady hands while patients screamed, calm above all things. "Want to see the skin? It's in the bin by the back door." He looked at the blood, at her, at the bin by the back door where, and she thanked every practical instinct she had ever developed. There was a rabbit skin from 2 days ago, close enough. He grunted, turned, walked out. The tall one was still in the doorway, that smile unchanged. "If you see the wolf, the large grey one, you should know that whoever is hiding it will answer for it the same way the wolf will." She looked at him with the mild irritation of a woman who had work to do and was being kept from it. "I'll keep that in mind." They left. She stood in the center of the cottage. Her hands were shaking. The ones that did not shake during wound care. The ones that had been stone on the riverbank. Shaking now, she allowed it for 30 seconds. Then stopped. Because there was work to do and shaking was not work. The next day at the market she saw Haddon. Haddon who sold herbs at the second stall. Haddon who she'd known since childhood. Who had given her peppermint drops when she was small and told her stories about plants on the upper ridges. Who had been, in the loose way of village relationships, something like a kind uncle who happened to sell dried lavender. Haddon was standing at the edge of his stall, talking to the tall man, the one whose smile didn't reach. She watched from the corner of the cloth merchant's booth, watched Haddon gesture toward the east side of the village, toward her cottage, watched the tall man nod, watched Haddon glance around to check if he was being observed, and she turned her head the right amount before his gaze swept past. She understood, and something in her chest went cold. Not anger exactly. Disappointment, the kind that comes from discovering that someone you trusted did not contain what you'd built them to contain in your head. Haddon had told them about the herbs, the volume she'd been buying, the wound care supplies that only made sense if you were treating something large and injured and not human. He knew her inventory because he supplied half of it. He knew her patterns, knew when she deviated. She did not confront him, did not ask why, did not give him the satisfaction of knowing she knew. She went to his stall, bought herbs, the wrong ones, deliberately, chamomile for anxiety, valerian for sleep, elderflower for colds, not a single wound care component. She chatted about the weather, the frost, the new batch of dried mint from southern traders, warm and pleasant and completely ordinary. And when she walked away, she knew that whatever Haddon reported next would contradict what he'd reported before. The information would muddy, the trail would blur, and the men with hard faces would have to decide which version of her to believe. She was learning things about herself, things that had been there all along, waiting for a reason to surface. That afternoon she took tea at the weaver's shop, 2 doors from the inn where Fenrick's men were staying. The weaver was a talker, the kind who collected information the way Mosca collected water, passively and constantly. Sarah listened 3 things. A message sent north the previous morning, content unknown, direction clear. 2 more men arrived from the passes overnight, 5 total now, and someone had asked about the herbalist's cottage, not Sarah's, Marin's. Whether anyone unusual had been seen near it. She went home at normal pace. Inside, spoke to the cottage. "He needs to move tonight, not tomorrow. Fenrick is accelerating." Aldrich arrived an hour before dark, through the door with the compressed focus of someone who had reached the same conclusion by a different route. Tonight, they sat. Fire between them. Carvings above it, he told her the plan, full version who he'd contact first. Which wolves were still loyal, where Fenrick was weakest. The formal challenge, specific words, specific place, specific ritual that could not be refused once invoked. Laid out with the precision of a man who had been building this in his head for 12 days while his body rebuilt itself. She listened, asked 2 questions about logistics, both sharper than he expected. When the fire had burned low, he looked at her. "I have led a pack for 11 years, and I have been alone in a way that is hard to explain to people who haven't carried it. The kind where everyone depends on you and nobody thinks to ask how you're holding up. You asked me. First day in this cottage, not what do you need, not what should I be do. You asked how I felt. Nobody has done that in 11 years. She looked at the carving on the shelf. The woman at the door, that's me, yes. She doesn't look afraid. No, why not? Because she knows what's coming back. She stood, crossed the room, put her hand against his jaw, felt warmth and tension, and underneath both something that had been building since a Tuesday in late autumn, when a woman waded into a river for reasons that had nothing to do with logic. "Come back to me." He turned his face into her hand, eyes closed. For one moment everything, the pack, the betrayal, the years, the ridge, the river, the weeks of silence and carved wood, was in the contact between her palm and his face. Nothing in existence could prevent it. He left before full dark. She stood on the step and watched the tree line take him the way it took everything, completely. Without negotiation, she went inside, found something useful to do with her hands, organized her herb stores, reorganized them when she realized she'd done it wrong because her hands knew the work, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. She made herself eat, went to bed, lay in the dark and felt the absence of the warmth that had been there for weeks. She did not sleep much. She was at Maren's before the old woman had lit her lamps, sitting at the workbench in the grey pre-dawn with dried chamomile in her hands. Not sorting it, not measuring it, shredding it. The mindless destruction of a woman whose body was in a cottage and whose mind was on a mountain pass in the dark, with a man who could turn into a wolf walking toward people who had already tried to kill him once and would not hesitate to finish the job. Maren arrived, lit the lamps, looked at Sarah, looked at the growing pile of chamomile dust, said nothing for 20 minutes. The lamps burned. Dawn crept up behind the trees. Sarah reduced another handful to powder without noticing. "He's gone back." Not a question. Maren's voice had the quality of a door that had been waiting to open. "Yes, and you're here shredding my chamomile because your own floor can't take any more pacing." She looked down. She had destroyed a meaningful quantity of product. Chamomile was not cheap. "I'll replace it." Maren sat across from her, hands flat on the workbench in the posture Sarah had learned to recognize over 6 years. Something important was about to be said. "How long have I known you?" "Since I was born. And in that time have I ever told you something about yourself that you didn't eventually find out was true?" Sarah was quiet. She could feel the conversation building towards something. The way weather builds, the air changes, the birds go quiet, everything waits. "I knew something was different about you 3 weeks ago. I knew the story about slipping on the bank was a story about slipping on the bank." Maren paused. "I know what the northern pack is. I know what the alpha of it is. You walked into the ash vein in late autumn to drag out something you didn't even know was going to survive. Did you think I would be surprised by what you'd dragged out?" Sarah opened her mouth, closed it. "Are you going to tell me to be careful?" No, the word landed clean, no hedge, no qualifier. "I'm going to tell you something I should have told you years ago." Maren stood, went to the high shelf, the one where the old books lived, wound patterns, plant identification, anatomy charts. She pulled down a box Sarah had never noticed behind the books. Small dark wood, worn at the corners from decades of handling. "Your mother pulled your father out of a flood when she was 19. He was a stranger. She didn't know him. She waded in and pulled him out because she could not watch something drown. And she never once regretted it." Sarah sat with this. Her parents had died when she was 4, a fever that took them both in the same week. She had grown up with Maren, had been raised by the village in the communal, imperfect way villages raised orphans. She knew almost nothing about who her parents had been as people, what they had chosen, what they had walked into. She hadn't known the shape of where she came from was this particular shape. The ash vein runs in your family, apparently dry, without sentiment. The kindest possible way to say it. But there's more. Maren set the box on the workbench, hands resting on the lid without opening it. "I need you to hear this because it changes what you think happened on that riverbank. I have treated their kind before." Sarah looked up 30 years ago. "Before you were born, the alpha before Aldrich, a wolf named Brennan, came to me with a wound that wouldn't heal. Ceremonial blade. I treated him for 3 weeks in this cottage. In the chair you're sitting in," she tapped the box. "I learned things. About their blades. About their rituals. About what those blades carry in the metal." She opened it. Inside, wrapped in yellowed linen, were dried herbs Sarah did not recognize. Dark, almost black, with a smell that was sharp and mineral and wrong. Not the smell of plants, but of something made to counteract something else. The ceremonial blade Fenric used was not ordinary. It carries a slow poison bred into the forge. It doesn't kill immediately. It suppresses the shift, locks the body in whatever form it holds when the blade connects, and over weeks it spreads, through tissue, into marrow, Until the body can't hold either form and collapses between them. Sarah's hands stopped moving. Chamomile dust forgotten, if you hadn't washed that wound the way I taught you. With river water first, moving water, then the poultice. If you had bandaged it dry the way most people would have, the poison would have set within hours. Aldrich would have died on that bank. Not from the wound, not from the cold. From the blade. She looked at Sarah. You saved him twice that morning without knowing it. Once from the river, once from the forge. The information hit her in the chest. Not the drama of it, the narrowness. The margin between what she had done and what she could have done differently. The thoroughness of a lesson learned 6 years ago applied without thought on a freezing riverbank. Always clean a wound with moving water first, Marin had said one Tuesday afternoon when Sarah was 17. Not still water. Moving water carries the debris away. Said it while demonstrating on a goat with an infected hoof. Sarah had learned it and filed it and used it on a wolf, without knowing the technique was the difference between alive and dead. Why didn't you tell me before? Because some things have to find their own shape. I could have told you the day you showed up soaking wet. I knew, but knowing and being ready for knowing are different things. Marin closed the box. You weren't ready, and now? Now he's on a mountain pass and the blade that cut him is still working. Slowly, the wound closed on the surface but the poison is in the tissue, moving deeper each day. If he shifts fully without the antidote, if the body tries to reorganize itself around the poison, it accelerates. A full shift right now, under the stress of a fight, could kill him before the shift completes. Sarah stood. The chair scraped the floor, sharp and final. He doesn't know, he might suspect. Alphas know the old blades. But this variant, it's newer, bred in the eastern forges. I only know it because Brennan described the original to me 30 years ago, and I kept track of what came after. She pushed the box across the workbench. This is the antidote. Applied directly to the wound site, it has to reach the tissue before a full shift or during one. The window is narrow. How narrow? Minutes. Once the shift begins, the body is in flux. The poison activates in flux. The antidote has to be in the tissue before the poison reaches the spine. Sarah looked at the box, looked at Marin, looked at her own hands which had gone very still. The stillness of a body that had already made a decision and was waiting for the rest of her to catch up. She recognized that feeling. She had felt it once before. On a riverbank in late autumn in water cold enough to stop a heart. Day 13 broke gray and wet. She went through the motions of morning. Dressed, ate, packed, but the packing was different. Not the small kit she carried to Marin's, the large one. The emergency kit, the one she used when a farmer's horse went down, or a child fell from a wall, or the work meant going to the wound instead of waiting for the wound to come to her. She wrapped the antidote in the center, cushioned on all sides, clean bandages, poultice, the strong thread and curved needle for wounds that needed closing. She packed the way you pack when you know exactly what you're walking into and have decided to walk into it anyway. Mid-morning a woodcutter came down from the eastern trail into the village. Sarah heard the news the way news traveled in small places, through 3 mouths before reaching hers, each adding its own color. But the core was clear. Sounds on the northern pass. Wolf sounds, not hunting sounds. Fighting. The kind of violence that carried on cold air in ways ordinary noise didn't. The woodcutter had heard it for an hour before it stopped. And then, his voice dropped. The way voices drop when what's being described exceeds the vocabulary available. A sound he couldn't name. Like a storm hitting rock. Like 2 things of equal size meeting each other with no intention of giving way. Sarah was already moving. At her cottage in minutes. Heaviest coat on, pack-shouldered. She went to the door and Marin was standing on the path. She did not ask how a 73-year-old woman had gotten there so fast. Urgency had its own physics. Marin held out a second bag, larger, heavier. The eastern trail. It splits at the Dead Oak, left fork, climbs steeply but it's shorter by 2 miles. You'll come out above the pass. Sight advantage. Sarah took the bag. Their eyes met. In that look was everything that 6 years of teaching had built. Steady hands, clean wounds, the philosophy of naming things. 6 years that had been, she understood now, training for this walk up this mountain. Marin did not say be careful. Did not say come back safe. The antidote works fastest if you get it in while the wound is still open. If the wound has closed, you'll need to reopen it. Sarah nodded, turned, walked. She found the eastern trail. Found the Dead Oak, split by old lightning. The 2 halves leaning apart, left fork. Steep. Marin had not exaggerated. Her thighs burned in the first quarter mile. breath coming in short pulls that fogged in cold air and disappeared. She climbed and got lost. Not dramatically. Not the kind of lost where you question which mountain range you're on. The subtle kind. The fork Maren described split again at a point Maren hadn't mentioned, probably because Maren last walked this trail 30 years ago and trails changed. Rocks shifted. Trees fell. New growth covered old markers. She stood at the second fork looking at two paths that both went up, and neither looked more correct than the other. She chose left because she had to choose something. The left path wound around a ridge and deposited her exactly where she'd started. 40 minutes. Gone. She stood at the false fork and breathed. She did not panic because panic was a luxury she could not afford, and also because Maren had once told her that panic was just energy pointed wrong, and if you could redirect it, it became focus. She redirected right fork. It climbed harder, narrowed to a track barely wide enough for boots, crossed a stream that soaked her to the ankle and turned her feet numb, then broke through a line of low pines, and she was above the pass, looking down, and she saw what was left of a fight. The snow that had fallen in the night was churned across the open ground. Dark patches where white should have been. Tracks telling a story, desperate circling, concentrated churning where two bodies had met and held. Long drag marks where something had been thrown or pushed across rock. She counted 5 separate impact furrows. 5 times something had hit the ground hard enough to leave a mark in frozen earth in the center of the pass. One figure standing. One on the ground. She scrambled down the ridge, lost her footing twice, didn't care. The pack bounced against her back. Cold air cut into her lungs. She crossed the distance in minutes that felt like something slower than minutes. Aldrich was standing. That registered first and mattered most for one bright second before the rest landed. He was upright, in a form that was between, not fully man, not fully wolf, something caught mid-process. One arm human, the other rippling with fur that appeared and receded. His torso fighting between shapes, the shift stalling, restarting, stalling again. His body trying to complete a transformation it kept abandoning. The poison. She understood instantly. He had shifted to fight. The fight demanded the wolf, and the wolf form had woken the blade's legacy in his tissue. Now his body was locked between states, trying to become one thing and being dragged back toward the other, and the effort of holding both was tearing him apart from the inside. The figure on the ground was large. Dark-furred, still. She did not look at it longer than necessary because Aldrich was the priority, and Aldrich was running out of time. She could see it in the way his body shuddered, in the rhythm of the failed shifts. In the dark lines she could see where skin became fur and fur became skin and neither held. Dark lines branching outward from the scar on his flank, the poison, spreading, reaching for his spine. She dropped to her knees beside him. His eyes found hers, the amber she knew. The same gaze from the riverbank, from the cottage table, from the dark when he'd turned his face into her hand. Except now there was pain behind it, real pain. The kind that came from biology fighting itself, the body trying to be two things and managing neither. You came. 2 words. Barely voice. Caught between a human throat and something else. She was already opening the pack. Already unwrapping the antidote. Already finding the wound site. The scar on his flank, healed on the surface, closed. And underneath, visible in the shifting state where neither form held stable, dark lines radiating outward, branching through the tissue like roots seeking water. Moving toward his spine, Maren had said, "If the wound has closed, you'll need to reopen it." She looked at the scar, the antidote in her hand, the knife in her kit. She picked up the knife. This is going to hurt. His eyes held hers. Permission and trust and the weight of a man who had spent 11 years as the strongest thing in every room now. Watching a 23-year-old woman prepare to cut him open with an herb knife on a frozen mountain pass. I've had worse mornings. She would have laughed if the situation allowed it. She cut, clean, fast. Along the scar line, Maren's teaching, don't hesitate, don't go shallow. The kindest cut is the one that does the job in a single pass. The tissue opened. Underneath, the dark lines were visible. Intricate, almost beautiful in a terrible way. The poison had mapped itself through his body like a second system, threading through muscle and connective tissue with a patience that suggested intelligence, or at least design. She packed the antidote into the open wound, deep, into the layers where the poison lived. The herbs were cold, not room temperature but genuinely cold, carrying their own climate. Aldrich made a sound, low, controlled. A man who refused to scream but whose body was insisting on being heard. She held the antidote in place, counted. Marin hadn't said how long, hadn't given her 30 seconds or 2 minutes. She held it and watched the dark lines and waited for something she'd recognize as change. The furthest tendrils, the ones closest to his spine, paused, held, and then slowly began to draw back, retreating toward the wound, toward the source, toward the antidote, pulling them in. Like ink absorbed into blotting paper, his body shuddered. The locked shift broke free, not gently. The way water moves when a dam gives. All at once, the wolf coming, the man going, the body choosing its shape with total commitment. She pulled her hands back, gave space, and the wolf was there, dark gray, enormous. The same wolf from the ash vein 6 weeks ago. Except the eyes were clear, and the body was whole, and the wound on the flank was open and bleeding, but bleeding clean. Red blood, honest blood, not the dark poisoned kind she'd seen under the scar. He lay in the snow and breathed deep, full. The breathing of something that had been fighting itself for 6 weeks and had finally stopped. She sat back on her heels, hands covered in blood, knees soaked, feet still numb from the stream. On a mountain pass next to a wolf the size of a small horse, with the wind picking up and the light going flat, the way mountain light went before weather turned. There's someone hurt on a mountain. I'm a healer. I don't need a reason beyond that. She said it to the wind, to herself, to the philosophy Marin had spent 6 years building into her bones. She repacked the wound. Proper poultice, clean bandages, thick linen from the larger kit, her hands steady throughout. The shaking would come later. It always came later. The wolf lay still under her hands and let her work. Can you walk? He stood slowly, testing legs, body, form, the shift complete. Fully wolf for the first time in 6 weeks. He was enormous, and the pass was quiet, and the wind carried the last sounds away toward peaks, where they would dissolve into the kind of silence mountains specialized in. They walked down together, the wolf and the woman, through the pines, past the false fork where she'd lost 40 minutes, along the stream, down the eastern trail that Marin had mapped from 30-year-old memory, and which had brought her, despite the extra fork and the lost time, exactly where she needed to be. The village came into view in late afternoon, gold light, the autumn kind that made everything look like it was being remembered rather than lived. And at the edge of the tree line, shapes wolf, 2 at first, then 3, then 5. Sitting at the margin where forest met open ground, heads low, ears forward, waiting for something they had hoped for and were now watching arrive. Wren was among them. Sarah recognized her by build and posture, upright, alert. The wounds Sarah had treated healed to scars. She had survived the trip. Probably had been enough. Aldrich stopped. The wolves looked at him. He looked at them. Something passed between them that Sarah could feel but not hear. Older than words, older than sound, a pack recognizing its leader. A bond strained but unbroken, finding its shape again. The wolves lowered their heads. Not submission, acknowledgement. The difference was subtle and mattered. He walked forward. They flanked him. 2 on each side. Wren at his shoulder. Moving together with the formation of something that had been scattered and was now whole. Sarah followed, behind them. At a distance, she chose deliberately. This was his return. The pack seeing what it needed to see. She did not need to be at the center. She needed to be where she had always been, at the edge, watching, ready, with medicine in her hands and steady work to offer. They reached the cottage. Wolves settled at the yard's edge, the settling of things that had arrived at a place and intended to stay. Aldrich shifted. She watched the body find its other form, wolf becoming man, immensity rearranging into different immensity. He stood in her yard in cold air, wearing nothing, which was a logistical problem she had not anticipated. She went inside, found the largest clothing she owned, which was not large enough. Brought it out. He dressed. The clothes were comically inadequate, but he was dressed and standing and whole. He came to the door. She opened it before he knocked, because she had been opening that door before he knocked for weeks, and because some things didn't need ceremony. They needed the absence of it. They looked at each other across the threshold. He was different, and the same. The difference was in how he stood, something fully inhabited, the authority completely present in a way it hadn't been before. The restraint of recovery replaced by the full measure of what he actually was. The same was his eyes. The same was the way they found her. It's done, Fenric? Challenged and answered, level voice. The cost of the answer packed into 3 words that refused to elaborate. She heard the weight, did not ask for detail. Not yet, the pack? It will take time. The damage is real. But the foundation held. He paused. I told you I would come back. You did. I want to tell you everything. All of it. Come in then. He crossed the threshold, came directly to where she stood, close enough that she had to tip her head back to see his face properly. Amber eyes holding everything they had always held and something new. The openness of a man who had set down the last thing he'd been carrying alone. The pack will need an alpha female. It has to be someone the pack chooses to follow. Someone who earns it by being exactly what she is. Is that what you're asking me? I'm telling you what's true. What I'm asking is different. I'm asking if you want this. All of it. The pack. The North. The long work of rebuilding. The mornings and the evenings and everything that comes between them. She thought about practical things, because that was what she did when the emotional truth of something was so large she needed to approach it from the side. She thought about the cottage, Maren, the work she had built, the carvings on the shelf, a woman 19 years old wading into a flood to save a stranger and never regretting it. Yes, she watched what the word did. A release, something held with great care for a long time, set down. He reached out and took her face in both hands. Large, careful. The hands that had carved wood with patience and precision and left it on her doorstep, like a language that didn't need words. I have been the most feared alpha in the Northern Territory for 11 years. And the only thing that has ever made me uncertain is you. Good. She put her hands over his. I pulled you out of a river. Whatever comes next, we're in it together. He said it like it was the word he'd been moving toward since the beginning. Since a riverbank in late autumn. Since cold water. Since a woman's arms under something enormous and a refusal to let go outside. The wolves raised their heads toward the cottage, held, then lowered again, settled. The recognition of something resolved moving through them, quietly, completely. The river moved below the tree line. The last of the autumn light came gold through the window and caught the shelf above the fire. 3 carved pieces. A river, current caught in grain, a wolf head turned, listening, a woman at a door looking out, none of them afraid. And here is where the story opens into something larger than itself. Because every good story does that, if you let it. It stops being about the people in it and starts being about the people listening to it. Sarah pulled a stranger out of a river. That is the fact at the center of everything. 20 minutes in cold water, a body too heavy for her to carry and too alive for her to leave. She didn't know what she was saving, didn't know who. Didn't know that the wound she cleaned with river water, moving water, not still, a Tuesday afternoon lesson from when she was 17, was carrying a slow poison that would have killed him by nightfall if she'd bandaged it dry. She didn't know any of that. She knew something was dying. She knew she could try. And there's something in that worth sitting with. Something beyond the wolves and the carved wood and the mountain pass. Something about what happens when you act before you calculate. When the body moves and the brain catches up later and the math doesn't work and you do it anyway. Aldrich said it plainest. Someone who would do that without knowing what I was. That was the whole architecture. The entire foundation of what grew between them rested on one thing. She helped him before she knew it mattered. Before she knew he was important. Before there was anything to gain. She helped him when helping was just helping. When the wolf was just a wolf, and the river was just a river, and the cold was just cold, and the only reason to go in was the reason that lives in the part of you that cannot watch something die when your hands are free. And that kind of thing, the kind you do when no one is watching and no one is keeping score, and the only audience is the river and it doesn't care, that kind of thing doesn't disappear. It becomes the ground that everything else is built on. How often do we walk past? That's the question underneath all of this. Not the big dramatic walking past, not ignoring a burning building or turning away from a car wreck. The small kind, the Tuesday morning kind. The person sitting across from you who looks fine but whose breathing has that pause at the end. The colleague who stopped laughing at meetings 3 weeks ago. The neighbor whose lights are on at 4 in the morning every morning now. We see it. We do. Most of us see it. And we keep moving because we've already decided, quickly, quietly, without even making it a decision, that it isn't ours to carry. The water is cold. The current is strong. We have our own mornings to get to. And sometimes that's right. Sometimes the math is correct and the risk is real, and the practical choice is to keep walking. But sometimes the thing on the bank is not what you think it is. Sometimes the stranger in the water becomes the person who changes the shape of your entire life, and you won't know. That's the part that matters. You won't know at the time. You'll know later, or you'll never know. Or you'll know in pieces over weeks and months the way Sarah learned. Through gifts on a doorstep and carved wood and a warmth in the dark that she didn't ask for and couldn't have predicted and eventually could not do without. Maren told Sarah something that she didn't know about her own parents, that her mother had done the same thing, pulled a stranger from a flood at 19, that the ash vein ran in the family, and maybe it does. Maybe there are people who are built that way, genetically predisposed to cold water and bad odds and the stubborn inability to walk past the thing that is dying on the bank. But I think it's simpler than genetics. I think it's a choice. And I think it's a choice that's available to everyone, every day, in ways that don't involve rivers or wolves or mountains. It's available at the office and the grocery store and the kitchen table. It's the choice to ask someone how they're doing and actually wait for the answer. To notice the pause at the end of someone's breath and not keep walking. To offer your hands, not because you know what you're saving, not because you've calculated the return, but because your hands are free and something in front of you needs them. Sarah saved Aldrich twice without knowing it, the river and the poison. A technique learned on a Tuesday from a woman with a goat, applied without special intention on a freezing riverbank. The small things done correctly because you were taught correctly. The ordinary, unspectacular work that nobody applauds. Sometimes those are the things that matter most, and you'll never know which ordinary moment today turns out to be the extraordinary one. You don't get to see the full picture while you're inside it. You see the wound, you see the water, you do the next right thing. 11 years Aldrich led that pack. 11 years of being the person everyone depended on and nobody asked about. And the thing that broke that open was not strength or power or strategy. It was a woman on a riverbank who looked at something broken and couldn't keep walking. That's it. That's the whole thing. So here is my question for you, and I mean it. Have you ever helped someone when they had nothing? No title, no money, no way to pay you back, and later found out there was more to them than you knew? Or has someone stood by you when you were at your lowest and had nothing to offer in return? Tell us what happened. Drop your story in the comments. Because the river runs in more families than anyone thinks. And the wolves on the bank are everywhere, at work, at home, in the chair across from you. And the people who wade in, the people who can't keep walking, those people changed the shape of everything. Every time.